It's been almost half a year since my last HLX video, and all sorts of rumors and schizo theories have appeared on the internet since then, uniting the entire gaming community. I purposely ignored this wave of hope and waited for it to blow over. All the named dates have passed, journalists and insiders have gone silent, and Kojima didn't receive a single award. So we can finally proceed with our usual breakdown of all the findings I've collected by analyzing updates in all Valve games over the last 6 months. There is a lot of info and topics to digest since interesting details continue to appear regularly, so it's safe to say that despite the broken promises in 2025, a new version of Half-Life 3 is very much alive and on the way to the announcement. Before you get angry with me and others, I want to remind you how all this madness in 2025 started. With this tweet where the voice actor for G-Man and Barney posted an odd teaser video with the hashtags Valve, Half-Life and G-Man. I want to release a separate video just to preserve the mass schizophrenia in the community, but today let's take things more seriously. But while you have time, check out Skins Monkey. Use code GABEN and get up to a $5 bonus. Select a few of your current skins, pick a new one in the same price range and exchange your old and ugly CSGO items to something new and shiny from Counter-Strike 2. Use code GABEN and buy skins much cheaper with a 30 plus 5% top-up bonus. Skins Monkey, links and my code down below. The biggest mystery is the delay in republishing the book Raising the Bar. For those who are unaware, in November 2024, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Half-Life 2, Valve promised to release a new edition of the book detailing the development process of the game. Interestingly, the re-edition promised stories about ideas and experiments for a continuation in the form of Episode 3, which never saw the light of day. I want to remind you that in the released 2-hour documentary we saw video footage of Episode 3 for the first time, as well as previously unseen features such as cut weapons and various game mechanics. In an unusual move, Valve gave a clear deadline. The book would be sent to print and published in 2025. The year ended without any news, so in my opinion, HLX or Half-Life 3 was supposed to be announced much earlier, but the developers simply cannot release the book because it most likely contains materials that would spoil the events or mechanics of the game. Beyond that, I think the current rumor that the game announcement was postponed due to a delay in the release of the new hardware has little to do with reality. If you're out of the loop, the rapid development of talking calculators is the reason why large companies began buying all sorts of components in insane batches. This naturally caused an unusual spike in prices, and the latest victim was RAM. The problem is that RAM is used for more than just computers, and unfortunately the chaos began right after the announcement of the Steam machines and Steam Frame, which likely disrupted Valve's plans. In my view, hardware delays are not correlated with game delays. Teams at Valve work almost independently, and any former or current employee will tell you that synchronizing the plans of two teams is extremely difficult due to the company's extremely specific workflow. The same thing happened with Half-Life Alyx, which was supposed to launch with the Valve Index VR headset in 2019. However, the game was delayed by a year, though the headset was released on time. Valve consistently says that they release their products and games when they are ready rather than waiting for a deadline they have trouble meeting. It's important to note that following the announcement of the new hardware, Valve assured all journalists that they are not currently developing any VR games. This once again debunks the theory that the next Half-Life game is just another tech demo. Nevertheless, let's return to the truly important topics. It's important to note that most of the findings are updates to the Source 2 engine itself rather than to a specific project. This happens because Valve makes exceptions when pushing code into the main engine branch. For example, if developers are making a weapon for a specific game, the weapon's code will be tagged with something like HLX, therefore any strings that mention it will be excluded from the engine commit and won't appear in other games. However, when developers add or change a more global system, for example ray tracing, it will likely appear in the engine's core, as the technology is quite useful and can be implemented into other games. Nevertheless, we can't forget about the human factor, and errors constantly happen, so first we'll discuss direct mentions of HLX. The first string HLX configurable lightweight body entity refers to the parameters that optimize the behavior of physical objects and their interaction with the environment, specifically to improve performance. For instance, if an object hasn't interacted with other objects or the player for an extended period, the developers can simplify its collision or bone calculations for ragdolls. The second string HLX configurable lightweight body collection indicates the ability to group these objects together. For example, if there is a pile of bodies or trash on the ground and the player has not started or has stopped interacting with them, the objects can be merged into one group, which simplifies calculations and significantly boosts performance. The next mention is located next to one of the volumetric events, which we will discuss a bit later. In this case, it's the area where a pile driver from Half-Life 2 called Thumper hits the ground and scares away antlions, and it kinda confirms their return on open territories in the new game. Whether that territory is a desert or some kind of Arctic like in the original story of Episode 3. Based on findings from the last few years, dynamic physics will be one of the core gameplay mechanics. New strings confirm that Valve is taking this work extremely seriously and continues to improve all aspects of the feature. In this case, we are talking about gravity zones in which physical objects and NPCs detect their current space or plane and how they should react to it. The most interesting thing is that gravity no longer pulls in only one direction, and it can now be tied to an object or point. This allows for gravitational anomalies in combat or puzzles, where the gravitational pull of one object affects others. I want to remind you that the developers experimented with these ideas at the end of Half-Life Alyx, where objects ignored basic physics, flew from side to side, and changed their movement vector entirely. However, that was purely a visual effect, when here we are talking about a direct influence on gameplay. New findings related to NPC navigation meshes confirmed these theories as well. Non-playable characters will understand the direction of the gravitational force. For instance, if a flat area begins to rotate but the point of attraction remains unchanged, their behavior won't be affected. In previous games of the series, the navigation mesh, the area in which NPCs could move, was static and automatically generated when baking the map. Now, however, it can change dynamically, and at the same time there are actual checks for when NPCs cannot handle the gravity and start to fall when the angle exceeds allowable values. Technically, this should change the basic understanding of what is a floor and what are walls. In a world like Zen, for example, opponents would be able to chase you along the walls, ceiling, or curved surfaces. The environment can rotate, fly, or deform, which naturally affects gameplay. Interestingly, in one of my previous videos I mentioned the rumor that the developers are preparing advanced weapon ballistics for HLX. This means that after a shot is fired, the bullet or projectile will actually travel the distance rather than hitting instantly regardless of range, as was done in previous games. New strings partially confirm this rumor, and in one of the parameters it clearly states that bullets can ignore standard gravity parameters if necessary. This can create interesting situations where the behavior of something you fire, such as a rocket or a bullet, changes in alternative gravity conditions. For instance, upon entering a certain area, the projectile could slow down, stop, or change trajectory. In other words, if you fire projectiles and the gravity suddenly flips, they could fly in the other direction or back at you. Along with advanced gravity, developers are exploring realistic properties for surfaces and objects. These surfaces and objects now have complex physical, thermal, and acoustic characteristics that directly affect gameplay. This is specifically related to fire, electricity, and different types of liquids. Parameters determine how quickly a surface heats up and at what temperature it begins to burn. For instance, metal heats up and transfers heat while wood catches fire instantly. The heat from a fire spreads within a certain radius, determining which nearby objects will heat up and possibly also catch fire. There are several types of fires which affect the visuals and sounds of burning. The same goes for electricity. Some materials conduct it while others do not. This is especially interesting given the appearance of two types of spillable liquids. In this case, we are talking about oil or gas and water. Therefore, we can assume that oil will catch fire when it interacts with a surface and water will conduct electricity. This is also kinda confirmed by a function that overrides surface properties. It's important to note that Valve experimented with these ideas in the early betas of Half-Life 2, when various containers would leak oil or water after being damaged, and in the so-called Episode 4, developed by Arcane, electricity was one of the key gameplay mechanics, so it's not surprising that the developers returned to old ideas once again. Furthermore, objects will have voxel density parameters for potential dynamic deformation. For example, some objects may be flexible and deform easily under load while keeping their final shape, like dents in metal. Others will return to their original shape, like rubber, and some will simply break, like wood. Deformation applies not only to objects, but also to the aforementioned surfaces, and any changes to these surfaces can affect the navigation mesh and NPC behavior. I doubt that Valve will make the entire environment fully deformable, destructible, or flammable, since they will probably just try to create the illusion of full interactivity in specific spots using clever tricks. Like they did the dynamic liquid in bottles in Half-Life Alyx, using a fake effect that barely impacts performance. Next, the developers continue refining the NPCs and their interactions with other characters. They are essentially returning to ideas from previous games and recreating more advanced versions of them on the new engine. In this case, we are talking about speech and facial animations. New systems allow NPCs to exchange different phrases depending on the situation, and speech semaphores make their communication more natural, cause NPCs won't interrupt each other and properly react to the player's actions. We saw a simplified version of this behavior in the Left 4 Dead games, where characters communicated through jokes and gave interesting reactions to all sorts of events in real time. Along with this, we finally see the return of one of the most powerful tools called Face Poser. It was used to create the most lifelike facial expressions in story dialogues, and choreo parameters include not only specific facial expressions, but also the character's general mood, which can change dynamically depending on the situation. In general, the mood system is a relatively new concept that was briefly used in previous games. Moreover, mood affects not only facial expressions, but also body behavior, which is applied in layers. Layering fear or aggression onto a base mood directly affects the general state. For example, a character's walk animation might become more crouched or instead more confident. Interestingly, the Aperture desk job files from 2021 mention 6 types of moods: neutral, happy, concerned, skeptical, scared, and angry. Judging by the strings, all NPCs will react to volumetric game events. Essentially, characters will have sensors that constantly scan the environment around them. The most basic sensations involve feeling the danger, panic, or the start of combat. These events are recorded in their memory, allowing them to behave more realistically and not forget a threat after a fixed timer. Volumetric events have a specific radius and duration, and the radius of each character's senses is determined individually. Some can sense farther away, some closer, and the environment will likely affect this parameter dynamically. For example, visibility or hearing will be worse in fog or due to other conditions, or conversely better. Characters can warn each other, and some monsters might react to potential food sources or be frightened by Thumper when it hits the ground. Similar mechanics were used in previous games, and the new features are a direct evolution of old ideas. Honestly, I think all these systems are designed for automated crowd behavior, such as background actors like rebels or combines, rather than main story characters. This is partially confirmed by the integration of new speech graphics technology, which generates facial expressions based on pre-recorded audio. This technology will automate dialogue and save resources on full face tracking for less important characters, allowing for more focus on important cutscenes. Now let's return to navigation and the navigation mesh. For the first time in Valve games, a mention of a crawl state has appeared. Previously, characters could only walk, jump, and crouch, but now, if the environment allows it, the game also checks for the ability to lie down. While I doubt this ability will be added for players, at the very least, we might expect a switch from standing to prone for NPCs. You might assume this is related to sliced zombies, but it's not quite right, cause technically they're a completely different creature that just walks slowly with a specific animation. Additionally, one string mentions the ability to climb over objects, similar to something that already exists in Deadlock. There's also a new mention of dynamic physical collisions. In all the previous Valve games, NPCs had an invisible bounding box or fixed size capsule that determined where they could and couldn't pass. However, new strings point to a much more flexible system, so if a creature's limb is torn off, its physical collision should change because a part is gone, and it should be able to fit into places it couldn't before. And now is the perfect time to discuss some new findings related to the damage system, which we have touched repeatedly in previous videos. In short, the developers are shifting from walking boxes with health to detailed damage of individual limbs and armor, which directly affects the behavior of non-player characters and vehicles. To simplify, this system divides bodies or objects into independent segments, each with its own health pool and damage levels. Nevertheless, damage to one of the segments will directly affect the overall health state, and some protective elements can fully or partially absorb damage until they break. The system supports various death scenarios when critical body parts are destroyed. For instance, a headshot could lead to instant death, whereas losing armor on an arm would only alter the appearance. Body parts now have weak spots that make creatures more vulnerable, so shooting an unprotected spot will be more effective, so hitting these spots causes cumulative and multiplicative damage. Excessive damage to them forces the character to change their behavior in an attempt to protect them. In some cases, weak points can recover over time. Similar mechanics can be seen when fighting the arcs in Arc Raiders or shooting the limbs off of aliens in Dead Space. Another key innovation is the transition to modular modifiers for game mechanics. Previously, most of the game logic and parameters were hard-coded with a bunch of strange checks, and changing them required a lot of effort from the developers and mod creators. Now, a large number of parameters are stored in VDATA configs, which are essentially just text files that contain game variables. This greatly improves development and helps mod creators because anyone will be able to make changes to the core components of the game. These files can store parameters for weapons, characters, vehicles, game logic, and much more. In Deadlock, for example, the VDATA configs include the heroes and troopers' stats, abilities, and items. Thanks to this system, even in the early stages of development, the community released and actively supports a modification called Prime Lock, which recreates the original cancelled iteration of the game known as Neon Prime. The mod is completely custom, from the interface to the new characters, abilities, and items created practically from scratch. Speaking of modifiers, almost all vehicle logic runs on VDATA configurations. These include physical properties such as mass, dimensions, friction coefficients, air resistance, and parameters for the suspension, tires, engine, and transmission. It also includes variables that control vehicle behavior, such as maximum speed, acceleration, braking, steering, and gear shifting. There are also various classes and parameters that hint at different types of vehicles with various characteristics and capabilities. As we've repeatedly discussed in previous videos, we're talking about highly realistic vehicles. New strings further delve into already known systems, but an interesting find is a new state of temporary ragdoll. Upon reaching a certain damage threshold in a collision with an enemy, they will transition into a ragdoll state instead of instant death, so they basically lose balance, fall, and roll. This logic is clearly demonstrated while interacting with NPCs using vehicles in the GTA game series. There's also a destruction system for vehicles that affects the driver, passengers, and the front or rear sides. Once again, I would like to remind you that former senior developers of the Forza games and former Rockstar Physics Engine developers came to work at Valve a few years ago specifically for these purposes. Returning to the topic of liquids, there are more examples of characters and the world's interactions with the water environment. This time, we are talking about the different types of water and their flow speeds. The old precipitation system has transitioned to VDATA configs with rain intensity and puddles that have wetting effects. There is also visual feedback in the form of ripples and effects when something falls or explodes in water, so it's similar to what we already have in CS2. According to the original story, episode 3 or the third game takes place in the Arctic. However, I find it weird that we haven't seen a single hint of snow in HLX yet. In previous videos, we've also repeatedly touched the new wind system, but now it's more than just a visual effect, it's a fully functional physical controller that affects all layers of gameplay. This includes everything from the character's clothing to the sounds and trajectory of physical objects. A global wind management system coordinates airflows across the entire map. So by using environment wind volume, developers can create zones with unique wind characteristics. For example, they can create windless zones inside buildings or zones with strong gusts in open spaces. The system supports complex cycles with changes in direction during strong winds. On top of that, they added turbulence, which consists of chaotic and unpredictable vortices. The wind now interacts directly with the physics engine. Using a special parameter, the game determines the force that pushes physical objects, and now they have weight and resistance parameters, based on which they will either move or remain stationary. Along with this, there's some kind of system for fans or controlled airflow. Developers can set the start and end of a flow, its direction and strength, which can change in real time. If necessary, they can randomize the flow, constantly changing its direction and speed. Fans can blow something out or work as a vacuum, attracting objects to a specific point. With sufficiently strong gusts, NPCs will be affected by physical force, causing them to lose balance and fall. To enable full interaction with the wind, the developers are preparing a new grass and foliage simulation that will sway in sync with gusts. Additionally, foliage now has density parameters, and during physical interaction, like when a player or NPC steps on grass, the grass will flatten and deform. And obviously, the new super advanced hair system will interact with the wind as well. As we've discussed in previous videos, hair is now a physical object that dynamically reacts to its environment. Hair is divided into voxel subgroups that include individual strands, and only a small number of main strands are simulated, while the remaining thousands of hairs simply follow them, significantly saving resources. They are rendered using shading, volume, and density maps, so the hair can change color, density, length, physical interaction, shadows, and level of detail. New commands confirmed that the hair will react to the parameters set in the main controller, so the hair will flutter in the wind and fully synchronize with changing flows. Next, a bit about graphics and minor visual features such as lens dirt effects or smudges of dust on the screen. Alongside these are bloom effects, or that soft halo that appears around bright light sources. There's also exposure tone mapping when moving from dark to light locations, as well as everything else on the list that we've seen in realistic first-person games over the last 20 years. Right after that comes volumetric and dynamic fog. Developers can create separate zones with different densities and properties. For instance, a room could have a light haze, causing light from lamps, a flashlight, or windows to create so-called god rays. And if the fog is very thick, it will either cast its own shadow or catch the shadows of other objects. Furthermore, developers can set the height of the fog, which can either travel along the ground or fill the entire location. Interestingly, for the first time in years, there are actual hints towards real-time ray tracing. Previously, RTX was only mentioned in the context of baking or previewing light in a map editor, but now we are talking about actual ray tracing with supersampling and ray reconstruction. These technologies can be seen in the recent Half-Life 2 RTX project by NVIDIA. And finally, I'll throw some shit on the fan. All of 2025 felt like 2019 shortly before the announcement of Half-Life Alyx. Updates to the company's flagship games slowed down, and a significant amount of time and effort was allocated to finalizing and polishing the new VR game. However, the current rumor is that HLX development has reached a point where it no longer requires all hands on deck, and those who have finished their work are starting to shift to other projects. One of them is an unknown game that I'll probably discuss at some point in the future. So leave a comment with a clock emoji if you watch this